My mother called me a disgrace in front of her friends and said I wasn't worth feeding. I left the house that day and never came back. 20 years later, 99 missed calls from her number. I attend the call. Please help. Hit subscribe before we keep going because trust me, you are going to want to see how this ends. The pager went off at 2 in the morning, the way it always does when the universe wants to remind you that you signed up for this life. Critical kidney failure. Incoming, family already screaming at the front desk about who they know on the board. I splashed water on my face, pulled my white coat over my scrubs, and walked into the chaos of the Lakeshore Memorial Emergency Wing like I had done 1,000 times before. A man in an expensive coat that did not belong in an A at 2 in the morning grabbed the first nurse he saw by the arm. "Do you know who my mother is?" he said, his voice shaking with rage and fear at the same time. "She is Vivian Calloway Marsh. She built half the children's wing donor list in this city. She gets the best doctor in this building right now. I don't care what it costs." I stepped around the curtain before the nurse could answer him. "I'm Dr. Sutton," I said. "I'll be taking over her case." The man turned around, and for a second I almost laughed at the irony standing in front of me. Tyler Marsh. My mother's golden son from her second marriage. He looked right through me like I was furniture. "Good," he said. "Get her stabilized and get her on the transplant list today. Not next week, today. We will make a generous donation to whatever department speeds that up." I didn't answer him. I walked past him to the bed, and there she was. Vivian Calloway Marsh. Smaller than I remembered, paler than I remembered, but those same sharp eyes, even half closed with pain, still looking at the world like it owed her something. She did not recognize me. Of course she didn't. The last time she looked at my face, I was an 8-year-old girl with a stutter she was ashamed of, standing in a hallway while she packed a single bag of my clothes and told me I would not be coming home with her from that trip to the country. "I'm going to need someone to talk to me about her history," I said calmly, pulling the chart toward me. "Family history of kidney disease, current medications, anything I should know." Whitney, Tyler's wife, answered before he could. "She's the most important woman in this city. That's what you need to know. And we need her moved up whatever list you people use." My husband already called the hospital president. I looked up at her, slow and steady, the way I had trained myself to look at every difficult family for the last 12 years. "There is no list you can call your way onto here," I said. "We follow federal allocation criteria, not phone calls." Whitney's mouth opened to argue, but a small, tired voice from the bed stopped her. "Who is this doctor?" Vivian asked, squinting at me in the fluorescent light. "I don't like how she's looking at me." "I've never met a patient who liked how I look at them at 2 in the morning. I said evenly, "That's usually when I'm doing my job right." She didn't laugh, but Tyler's jaw tightened like he wanted to say something and thought better of it. "I'll explain everything once we get your labs back," I said, and walked out before my voice could betray anything else. In the hallway, I had to stop and put my hand against the cold tile wall for a second, because my chest was doing something it hadn't done in 20 years. I want to take you back to the exact afternoon this all started, not with some slow explanation, but with the words I still hear in my sleep. I was 8, standing in the marble foyer of the Calloway Marsh estate, in a navy dress that was a size too big because nobody had bothered to buy me a new one in over a year. There was a charity gala happening that night, and I had been told to stay upstairs and be quiet. I came down anyway, because I wanted to show my mother the drawing I made for her, a picture of the two of us, holding hands, under a sun with a smiley face. She was mid-laugh with 3 women in pearls when I tugged on her dress and tried to say, "Look what I made you." Except the words caught the way they always did, the way my speech therapist said would get better with time and practice. And instead of one sentence coming out clean, it came out broken, stuttered, repeated 3 times before it finally landed. The whole circle of women went quiet. One of them actually said, "Oh, bless her heart," in that tone that means the exact opposite of bless. My mother's face turned a color I had never seen before. She grabbed my arm, not gently, and pulled me into the coat closet off the foyer, gripping my shoulders so hard it left marks I didn't show anyone for days. "Do you understand what you just did to me?" she hissed. "Do you understand what people will say now?" "I'm sorry," I tried to say, and of course it came out wrong, the S catching, repeating, and she actually flinched like I had hit her. "Stop talking," she snapped. Just stop. You embarrass yourself every time you open your mouth, and you embarrass me. 2 weeks later, she told me we were going on a special trip together, just the two of us, to see a beautiful old house in the country. The beautiful old house in the country was Maple Street Home for Children, a state-run group home 2 hours outside the city. She walked me up to the front steps, knelt down to my eye level, and said the words I have never been able to fully forget no matter how many years of therapy I have paid for since. "You are a disgrace to this family," she said, calm as anything, like she was telling me the weather, and I cannot have a disgrace living under my roof. Then she stood up, smoothed her skirt, and walked back to the car without looking back once. I stood on those steps until a staff member named Miss Dolores came and gently took my hand and walked me inside. That was the last time I saw my mother's face for 20 years, until tonight, on a hospital bed, begging me to save her life. I want to be clear about something before we go further, because this is not a story about a little girl who grew up and got lucky. Maple Street Home for Children was underfunded, understaffed and overcrowded, and most nights there wasn't enough heat or enough food to go around. I aged out of the system at 18 with one bag of clothes. A stutter I had mostly trained out of my own voice through sheer stubborn repetition, and absolutely nothing else. I worked the overnight stock shift at a grocery store and the early morning shift at a diner just to afford a single dorm room at community college, sleeping maybe 4 hours a night for years. A professor named Dr. Holloway saw something in me during an anatomy class and helped me apply for every scholarship that existed for foster and former foster youth. I will not pretend the next 15 years were easy, because they weren't. But I will tell you that every single time I wanted to quit, I thought about a woman in pearls calling me a disgrace, and I used that as fuel instead of letting it bury me. By 30, I was Dr. Grace Sutton, Chief of Transplant Surgery at Lakeshore Memorial, one of the youngest surgeons to ever hold that title in the hospital's history. And not one person in that hospital knew my real last name had once been Calloway. Now back to that hallway, 2 in the morning, my hand against the cold tile wall. My own mother lying in a bed 40 feet away, not knowing the surgeon she had been begging for was the daughter she threw away. I composed myself because that's what I had trained 2 decades to be able to do, and I walked back into that room like a professional, not a daughter. Her labs came back within the hour, and they were bad. End-stage renal failure, almost certainly years in the making. Almost certainly ignored because Vivian Calloway Marsh did not believe rules about doctor visits applied to women like her. She needs a transplant, and she needs one soon. I told the family in the small consultation room down the hall. In the meantime, we start dialysis immediately, and we get her listed. Listed where, Tyler said, like the word itself offended him. We don't have time to wait on some government list. You said yourself it's urgent. Everyone waits on the same list, I said. That's how it works. And how it's supposed to work. Whitney let out a short, sharp laugh that had no humor in it at all. You clearly don't understand who we are, she said. The Calloway Marsh Family Foundation funds an entire wing of this hospital's pediatric unit. I'm sure that's worth something. I kept my face perfectly still, even though something cold moved through my stomach at the mention of that foundation's name, because I knew exactly which pediatric wing she meant. And I knew exactly which children's home that foundation claimed to support every single year in their glossy charity brochures. It's worth nothing here, I said. This isn't a hotel upgrade. It's an organ allocation system built to be fair to every single patient regardless of what they can donate. That's when Tyler's tone shifted, quieter, almost businesslike. The way men like him talk when they think they're being clever. What if we found a living donor, he said. A direct donation. We could skip the list entirely, couldn't we, if a family member was a match? I looked at him for a long moment. We would need to test for compatibility, but yes, in theory, a living donor changes the timeline, I said. Then test me, he said quickly, then added, actually, test all of us. Somebody in this family has to be a match. I want you to remember that line, because it matters later. Somebody in this family has to be a match, he said. Not realizing the woman standing across from him in a white coat had grown up sharing more DNA with his mother than anyone in that room. We ran the tests over the next 2 days, and during that window, something happened that cracked this entire story wide open and made it about far more than one dying woman in a hospital bed. A nurse on my floor, an older woman named Carol, who had worked there longer than I had been alive, mentioned something in passing that stopped me cold in the hallway. "There's a young woman who keeps showing up at visiting hours asking about Mrs. Calloway Marsh," Carol said, "but the family won't let her in. Says her name is Lily Calloway. Says she's family. But Mr. Marsh told security to keep her out." I asked Carol to describe her, and the second she did, my stomach dropped. Because she was describing a face that looked almost exactly like the one I see in the mirror every morning, just younger. I found Lily sitting on a bench outside the hospital that same evening, in a coat that was too thin for the weather, looking exhausted in a way I recognized instantly because I had worn that exact exhaustion myself for years. "I'm Dr. Sutton," I said carefully, sitting down beside her. "I hear you've been trying to see Vivian Calloway Marsh." "She's my mother," Lily said flatly, like she expected me not to believe her. "She gave me up when I was 6. Dropped me at a group home 2 states over and never came back. I only found out she was sick because a cousin posted about it online." I sat very still on that bench for what felt like a full minute. "She did the same thing to me," I finally said, "when I was 8, except it was Maple Street Home for Children, not 2 states over, but the same exact story." Lily turned and looked at me properly for the first time, and I watched her face go through the same disbelief I was feeling. "You're my sister," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am your sister," I said back, and for the first time in 20 years I felt something other than numbness when I thought about that woman lying upstairs in a hospital bed. This is where the story stopped being about one selfish mother and became about a family that had built an entire empire of charity. Galas and foundation dinners on the backs of children they had personally thrown away, and I was not going to let that stand quietly. That night, sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage, I called the one person who had known my whole story since the beginning. Maria Chun, my closest friend since our shared dorm room in community college, now a forensic accountant who had built her career taking apart exactly this kind of family. "Maria, I need a favor. And I need you to not ask why for the next 10 minutes, I said. "Tell me everything," she said, and I did. I told her about Vivian, about Tyler, about Whitney's mention of the Calloway Marsh Family Foundation funding the pediatric wing, and about Lily sitting alone on a bench outside a hospital her own mother was inside of. "Grace," Maria said slowly, "that foundation has been on my radar for 2 years. There have been whispers about discrepancies in their filed donations versus what actually reaches the charities they claim to support, including, and I want you to brace yourself, including Maple Street Home for Children." I sat in that parked car for a long time after we hung up, just breathing. The same woman who called me a disgrace and abandoned me at that exact group home had apparently spent the last 15 years using that same group home's name on tax paperwork to make herself look generous at galas, while quietly skimming a chunk of every donation back into a private account. I drove home that night instead of going back inside, and I sat on the floor of my own kitchen at 4 in the morning with my back against the cabinets, the way I used to sit on the floor of the group home's hallway when the other kids were asleep and the quiet got too loud. For 1 week, ugly minute, I actually considered just doing what Tyler wanted. Testing myself as a donor, quietly, privately, letting her live without ever telling her who I was. Just to make the noise in my own head stop. Just to finally be the bigger person one more time, the way I had been the bigger person my entire childhood. I thought about Lily on that bench in her thin coat, and I thought about a 6-year-old girl somewhere being told the exact same lie I was told, that she did not reflect well on the family. The week minute passed. Being the bigger person does not mean handing your body and your silence to someone who has never once apologized for taking everything else from you. I felt something rock bottom and clarifying happen in my chest that night, somewhere between grief and rage. The kind of low point where you finally stop asking why someone hurt you and start asking what you're going to do about it. I am not a person who believes in revenge for revenge's sake, and I want to say that clearly, because what I did next was not about hurting a dying woman. It was about making sure the truth came out, legally, completely, and permanently, before that truth could be buried under one more charity gala photo of Vivian Calloway Marsh smiling for the cameras. The next morning, I did 3 things, quietly, carefully, the way you move when you only get one shot at doing something right. First, I called the hospital's Ethics and Compliance Board and formally reported that the patient's family had attempted to solicit preferential treatment on the transplant list in exchange for a donation, with Carol and another nurse as witnesses to the conversation. Second, I connected Maria with a state regulator she already had a relationship with, someone who had been quietly building a file on nonprofit foundations that misrepresented where donor funds actually went. Third, I called a lawyer named Daniel Reyes, who had represented foster youth pro bono for years, and asked him what my legal standing was if I wanted to formally support Lily in coming forward as an heir and a victim of the same abandonment pattern as me. "You have more standing than you think," Daniel told me, "especially if there's a documented pattern of the same act repeated against multiple children by the same parent, especially if foundation money tied to that exact abandonment is involved." Over the following 2 weeks, while Vivian remained stable on dialysis and the family grew louder and angrier about the speed of the transplant list, Maria quietly built a case file that would have made any prosecutor's eyes light up. 3 years of foundation tax filings claiming 6-figure annual donations to Maple Street Home for Children, cross-referenced against the actual bank statements of Maple Street Home for Children, which showed barely a fraction of that amount ever arriving. A pattern of wire transfers from the foundation's account into a private account controlled jointly by Vivian and Tyler, labeled as administrative fees that were nearly 40% of total donations, far above any reasonable industry standard. And buried in old county records, an adoption and custody filing from 22 years ago, showing that Vivian had quietly signed away parental rights to a second daughter, Lily, just 4 years after doing the same thing to me. Both times citing, in her own handwritten words on the form, "The child does not reflect well on the family." I read that line 3 times before I had to put the folder down. "The child does not reflect well on the family." Not me as an individual problem, not a one-time mistake in judgment, a pattern, written down in her own handwriting, twice. Around this same time, Tyler came to find me in the surgical wing, and I want you to understand the kind of arrogance we were dealing with, because he wasn't even being subtle anymore. "Look, doctor," he said, closing the door to the small office behind him, "I know how these hospital boards work, and I know my mother's foundation has donated enough to this institution that a favor could be arranged quietly. I'm not asking for anything illegal, I'm asking for an understanding." I let him finish completely before I responded. "Mr. Marsh," I said, "what you're describing is illegal. It's called solicitation of preferential medical treatment through inducement, and I'd strongly advise you to stop saying things like that in this hospital." His face went red, then he tried a different angle, leaning forward like we were suddenly on the same side. "You don't understand what kind of pressure I'm under," he said. "If my mother dies, half the foundation's board seats and the family trust restructure in ways that are not good for me. I need her alive, and I need this handled fast." I want you to notice what he just admitted to me, in a hospital office, thinking I was simply an obstacle to manage. He wasn't desperate to save his mother out of love. He was desperate to save his mother because her death would trigger a financial restructuring he did not want. I didn't say any of that out loud to him in that moment. I simply said, "I understand you're under a lot of stress, and I'll do everything medically appropriate for your mother." And then I walked him out and went straight to write down every word of that conversation while it was still fresh. That conversation became evidence too. Daniel had one more piece of advice that week, and it stuck with me because it was so simple. "Don't move until the file is finished," he said. "Amateurs expose half a truth and let the other side spin the rest. Professionals wait until there is nothing left to spin." So I waited, and while I waited, I kept treating Vivian exactly the way I treated every other patient on my floor. No warmth, no cruelty, just competence, dialysis on schedule. Labs checked twice daily, the same standard of care I would give a stranger. She asked me once, during a routine check, why I seemed familiar to her, and I told her I got that a lot, and walked out before my hands could start shaking. By the 3rd week, the file Maria, Daniel, and I had built was airtight enough that the state regulator's office quietly opened a formal investigation into the Callaway Marsh Family Foundation. And Daniel had filed paperwork on Lily's behalf asserting her claim as an overlooked heir with documented evidence of parental abandonment matching a pattern. None of this had become public yet. That was intentional. Because the next part of this story is the part where everything I had been quietly building came together in front of the exact people who had spent 2 decades thinking a closed coat closet door and a quiet drive to a group home meant the problem simply disappeared. The Callaway Marsh Family Foundation's annual Children's Gala happened to be scheduled for that same month, an event Vivian had chaired for 15 straight years. The same glittering room full of pearls and donor plaques that had once watched an 8-year-old girl stutter in front of her own mother and get hissed at in a coat closet for it. Vivian, still recovering and still without a transplant, insisted on attending from a wheelchair because appearances mattered more to her than almost anything, even her own health. I wanted to be honest with you, I almost didn't go. But Daniel convinced me that the most powerful thing I could do was not hide in the hospital while this story played out in newspapers, but stand in that exact room, in front of those exact people, and let the truth land the way it should have landed 20 years earlier. So I went in a plain navy dress, the same color I realized later as the too big dress I wore the day she called me a disgrace. Lily came with me, holding my hand the way I imagine I would have held hers if we had grown up together instead of being thrown away 2 states and 2 years apart. Tyler saw us first, near the entrance, and I watched real fear cross his face for the first time since I had met him. "What is she doing here?" he hissed at his mother, gesturing at me, "and who is that with her?" Vivian looked up from her wheelchair, confused, then her eyes moved to Lily's face, and something in her expression cracked. Because even she, even after all these years, could see her own features staring back at her from a face she had abandoned at 6 years old. Before anyone could recover, the Foundation's longtime board chair, a kind elderly man named Mr. Whitfield, who genuinely believed in the charity work he thought he was funding, took the small stage to make his usual opening remarks honoring Vivian's years of generous leadership. That's when Daniel, standing quietly near the back with a folder in his hand, nodded at me. I walked to the small stage microphone before Mr. Whitfield finished, and I asked, politely, if I could share something relevant to the Foundation's work, as both a donor's family member and as a physician treating Mrs. Callaway Marsh. The room went quiet in that particular way rooms full of wealthy people go quiet when they sense something is about to ruin the evening. "My name is Dr. Grace Sutton," I said, "and I have been Mrs. Callaway Marsh's treating physician for the past month. But that's not actually why I'm standing here." I looked directly at my mother for the first time in 20 years and let 4 words land exactly where they needed to. "I'm your daughter, Vivian." Gasps moved through that room like wind through dry leaves. Her face went the color of the white tablecloths, and her wheelchair actually rolled back an inch as she physically recoiled from the words. "The girl you left at Maple Street Home for Children, when I was 8, I continued. "The girl you called a disgrace, because of a stutter I have not had since I was 12 years old, except apparently that wasn't a one-time mistake." I gestured to Lily, who stood tall beside me despite the trembling I could see in her hands. "This is Lily, your other daughter, the one you abandoned at 6 2 states away," citing the exact same reason in writing, that she did not reflect well on the family. A woman near the front actually whispered, "Oh my God," loud enough for half the room to hear. "And here's the part that I think this Foundation's generous donors deserve to know," I said before Tyler or Whitney could pull me off that stage. "The Maple Street Home for Children, the very same group home where 2 of your own daughters were abandoned, has received only a fraction of the donations this foundation has publicly claimed for the last 3 years, while the rest was quietly transferred into a private account." Mr. Whitfield, the kind elderly board chair, turned slowly to look at Vivian, the color draining from his own face as decades of trust visibly crumbled in real time. "That's a lie," Tyler shouted, pushing toward the stage. "This is a defamatory attack. Get her off this stage right now." Daniel stepped forward calmly, holding up the folder. "It's not a lie, Mr. Marsh," he said evenly. "It's a state investigation that's been ongoing for 3 weeks. And these documents are public record as of this morning's filing. Every reporter in this room has already received a copy." That last line hit harder than anything I had said, because I watched at least 4 people in that room quietly check their phones, and I knew exactly what they were finding. A reporter near the back, a woman I recognized from the local news desk, raised her hand without waiting to be called on. "Dr. Sutton," she said, Are you saying Mrs. Calloway Marsh personally signed off on these fund transfers? Or are you alleging her son acted alone? I have copies of bank authorizations with both their signatures, I said, which I'm sure the state investigators would be happy to walk you through tomorrow morning. Mr. Whitfield, the elderly board chair, set down the small index card with his prepared remarks on it, his hand visibly trembling. Vivian, he said quietly, almost pleading, tell me this isn't true. Tell me I haven't stood up at 15 of these dinners praising a lie. She didn't answer him. She looked at her own hands instead, the same hands that had once gripped my shoulders hard enough to bruise in a coat closet. And for the first time in my life, I watched my mother have absolutely nothing to say. Vivian's voice, when it finally came, was smaller than I had ever heard it. Smaller even than the voice that told an 8-year-old girl she was a disgrace. Grace, she said. And hearing my actual first name come out of her mouth after 20 years did something strange to my chest. I did what I thought was best for the family. You have to understand the pressure I was under. I did not raise my voice, because I had spent 20 years learning that the calmest voice in the room always lands the hardest. I understand pressure, I said. I understand it better than you ever will, because I built an entire life and an entire career out of the wreckage you left behind. The difference between us is that I never once used a child's suffering to fund a charity gala. The room around us had gone completely, utterly silent. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks after that gala, because the karma in this story did not come from anything dramatic or violent. It came from the slow, grinding machinery of consequences finally catching up to people who thought they were untouchable. The state investigation Maria had quietly helped build went public within 48 hours. And within a month, the Calloway Marsh Family Foundation had its nonprofit status formally suspended pending a full audit, with felony fraud charges filed against both Vivian and Tyler for diversion of charitable funds. Tyler's business partners, men who had only tolerated him because of his mother's social standing and donor connections, quietly dissolved their partnership with him within the same month. And 2 of his largest real estate deals collapsed when investors pulled out rather than be associated with a fraud investigation. Whitney filed for divorce 11 days after the gala, and I will tell you honestly, I felt nothing watching that news arrive. Because some people only ever loved the version of you that came with money attached. The country club Vivian had belonged to for 30 years quietly revoked her membership 2 weeks after the story broke, citing a clause about conduct that brings the club into disrepute, the same kind of cold, polite language she had once used on an 8-year-old girl in a coat closet. Women who had spent 15 years calling themselves her closest friends stopped returning her calls within a month, which I suppose is its own kind of justice. Watching a woman who built her entire identity on appearances lose every single person who only ever liked the appearance. The Hospital Ethics Board formally banned the Marsh family from any future involvement in donor-related preferential treatment discussions. And Tyler's attempted solicitation conversation with me became part of a formal complaint that nearly cost him further legal standing on top of the fraud charges. Vivian's case is the part people always ask me about because they expect me to say I let her die. And I want to be very clear that I never would have done that, because that is not who I built myself to be. And that is not justice. That is just becoming exactly what she was. She remained on the standard kidney transplant list, exactly where federal law and basic human decency say every patient belongs. No preferential treatment, no special calls, nothing skipped. She eventually received a kidney from a deceased donor match 4 months later in a hospital 2 states away, because by then, the scandal had made it impossible for her to remain a patient anywhere near Lakeshore Memorial without reporters camping outside. I did not visit her in that hospital, and I have not spoken to her since the night of that gala. Some viewers might want me to say I forgave her, that we hugged it out, that blood always finds its way back together in the end. But real karma stories don't always end that way, and I think pretending they do does a disservice to anyone watching this, who is still waiting for an apology that may never come. What I can tell you is what actually happened to the people who mattered. Maple Street Home for Children received a settlement from the dissolved foundation's recovered assets large enough to fully renovate their heating system and add 2 new staff positions. Something I made sure Daniel pushed for specifically in the legal proceedings. Because that building owed me nothing, but I owed it everything. Lily moved into my spare bedroom that same month, and we spent the first few weeks just sitting on my couch most nights, trading stories about group homes 2 states apart that somehow sounded almost identical. 2 little girls learning the exact same lesson at different ages from the exact same woman. She's in nursing school now 2 years in, and some nights when she's exhausted from clinical rotations, I catch her rubbing her throat the way I used to when my words got stuck as a kid, and I just sit with her until it passes, the way nobody ever sat with me. We have a tradition now, small and silly, where every year on the anniversary of the day we found each other on that bench, we drive out to Maple Street Home for Children together and drop off bags of winter coats, the kind neither of us ever had enough of growing up. Last year, a staff member there told us a little girl with a stutter had just been placed in the home, scared and silent. And Lily and I looked at each other without needing to say a word, because we both knew exactly which room we were walking straight to. I still think about that coat closet sometimes, the smell of wool coats and her perfume, her hands gripping my shoulders hard enough to bruise. The words that took me 20 years and 1 hospital bed to finally say back to her. But I think about it differently now. Because the 8-year-old girl standing on those orphanage steps had no idea that the woman walking away from her would one day be wheeled into her hospital, needing the very life that woman tried to throw away. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. The people who call you a disgrace are very rarely talking about who you actually are. They are talking about who they need you to be in order to feel comfortable with themselves, and that is a problem that belongs entirely to them. You do not have to carry it for them, not for 20 years, not for one more day. Build the life they said you couldn't, and one day you may not even need to ask for an apology, because the truth will walk into the room and introduce itself for you. Somewhere right now, there is a kid sitting on a set of cold front steps, certain that the person walking away from them gets the last word. They don't. You do eventually if you let yourself become the proof. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe, because there are more stories just like it coming. And somewhere out there, somebody needs to hear that karma is real, and it is patient, and it always knows exactly where to find you.